Welcome to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen of the Government Accountability Project. President Obama says his stimulus plan focuses on three priorities: healthcare, education, and energy. He's bracing for fights on Capitol Hill over all of his priorities, but his focus on alternative renewable energy as a way of combating climate change, ending our reliance on Middle Eastern oil, and putting people to work in conservation and renewable energy jobs represents a clear break from the past 8 years. But how sharp a break is it really? And what role does the Obama administration see nuclear power playing in our energy mix? For answers, we turn to Joe Romm, a senior scholar at the Center for American Progress, a former Clinton energy official, the author of Hell and High Water, and the editor of a popular blog, climateprogress.org. We're also joined by Bob Alvarez, a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, a former senior policy advisor on national security and the environment to President Clinton, and the author of the report Risky Appropriations: Gambling U.S. Energy Policy on the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership. Welcome both of you to Whistle Where You Work.
Thank you.
Thanks. Joe, let's start with you. Tell us what's some of the elements of the Obama energy plan.
Well, he has decided to ramp up clean energy research and development and deployment considerably. The stimulus probably spends $50 billion a year over the next 2 years on a combination of tax credits and incentives for clean energy and actual deployment of things like weatherizing homes of low-income households. He is committed to spend $15 billion a year in his clean energy plan. He is committed to having a cap and reductions of greenhouse gas emissions in a bill that will probably be developed over the next year. He's committed to double renewable energy in this country in his first term and change the transmission system to enable renewables, to have a smart grid that will enable efficiency. He's in favor of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So it's really across the board. He is really appears to be quite serious about a clean energy transition.
And this is intended, though, as a stimulus plan for the economy. What are the chances that we're really going to see a boom in employment in conservation and renewable energy production and distribution? Well,
one of the biggest sources of jobs in the energy industry last year was wind power, which we broke the record. In 2008, we became once again the world leader in the deployment of wind power. With 8,400 megawatts added, we added 35,000 new jobs in wind power. So, I think, and wind power is now about 1.5% of U.S. electricity. So, no, I expect that you'll see a lot of jobs in renewable energy. I think you're going to see a lot of jobs in things like weatherizing houses and making federal buildings more energy efficient. And that's a lot of that is not very skilled labor. I mean, we're talking about caulk guns, about putting in insulation. Some of it's more sophisticated, doing energy audits, building energy efficient windows and lighting. So it's kind of a spectrum of jobs and technologies, and I actually think it's a pretty good mix.
So even if we double 1.5%, which you say is the wind portion of the energy mix, we're still talking about a rather small proportion of the overall energy resources in the economy. What does the budget say about natural gas and oil development and offshore oil development?
Well, in the case of oil, the president's been pretty strong on wanting to push energy efficiency, and indeed he gave the state of California he's in the process of giving the state of California a waiver so that California and about a dozen other states representing half the population of the country can have much stronger fuel economy standards. And my guess is that the major focus of his strategy in transportation is going to be energy efficiency and alternative fuel vehicles. He is a big booster of natural gas. It now appears that there's a lot more natural gas in the United States than people thought, trapped in these shale formations. And my guess is you're going to hear a lot more about natural gas in the coming years. and I think it's going to be a big piece of what he tries to do.
We're also hearing a lot about so-called clean coal, which is and there's money in the budget for coal. There's a lot of bipartisan support for clean coal, especially in coal-producing, coal mining states. What's your take on that?
Well, I just did a big blog post at climateprogress.org. The Economist has a major editorial and technology briefing in which they warn that clean coal is kind of right now just an illusion. There are no major clean coal plants. And by clean coal, I don't like to use that term. This is trying to gasify coal, capture the carbon dioxide, and bury it permanently underground. My guess is we are 10 to 20 years away from a serious commercial deployment of this technology. The Bush administration had a centerpiece program called FutureGen, which was a $1 billion program to develop this carbon capture and storage. They abandoned it about a year ago. It was mismanaged, and the coal industry was not willing to put up its fair share. It now appears that in the stimulus budget, there is enough money to resuscitate the program. It would be in the state of Illinois, and there are being articles written about it right now. I think, by the way, it is worthwhile trying to do some demonstration projects to develop the technology, because we're going to need every conceivable technology we have in the next few decades if we're going to avoid catastrophic global warming. But I don't think anybody should be under the illusion that coal with carbon capture and storage is going to be a practical and affordable solution. Certainly not by 2020, and it would take a lot of effort just to get there by 2030.
Bob, during the presidential campaign, Barack Obama talked about nuclear power being part of the energy mix and a form of clean energy as well. And many environmentalists, or at least some environmentalists, and some who used to be opposed to nuclear power are now saying, well, it is a clean energy resource and we should turn to it as part of the solution to global warming. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that it certainly does not have any significant impact in terms of release of carbon gases, and that's why they call it clean. But it's not clean at all. I mean, it's you can't look at nuclear energy just solely in that vacuum of whether or not it emits carbon when it produces electricity. The other aspects of nuclear power you have to take very seriously are its cost, which seems to be going out of the roof right now. We're looking at around $10 billion per reactor estimated costs. Safety, we've sort of been lulled into a sort of a level of complacency about the safety of nuclear technologies because, well, we haven't had a catastrophic accident for 23 years now. So, but these machines have low probability but high consequence events. I mean, the kinds of things that can happen with a nuclear power plant could render areas substantially larger than that was contaminated by Chernobyl uninhabitable for hundreds of years. And we have to understand and deal with those kinds of situations. And then there's the radioactive waste legacy. What do we do with this stuff? Are we going to find a successful resting place for it? Right now, the Obama administration has announced that it's essentially going to pull up stakes from the proposed Yucca Mountain site. And that sort of puts the nuclear waste disposal problem up in the air because we definitely need to have a geological disposal solution for these materials. These are materials which are extremely dangerous.
Now, what about recycling, reprocessing spent nuclear fuel? That's what the French do, don't they?
Well, they say they do. Recycling, if you look at the basic principles of recycling, and that being that this somehow can be done cost effectively, it can reduce pollution, and it makes the world a better place. On all three accounts, spent nuclear fuel recycling fails the test. What the French have been doing is separating out plutonium and uranium from other radioactive waste byproducts and releasing enormous amounts of radioactivity into the environment. The nations of Norway, Sweden, Ireland now find that the shores are so contaminated that at levels 1,000 times above fallout levels from bomb testing from these reprocessing plants, have been seeking to shut them down. The amount of waste that the French have generated still is going to have to be disposed. The issue of waste disposal, reprocessing reduces the volume, but the volume and weight are not the controlling factors. The key controlling factor for radioactive waste is decay heat. In other words, these radioactive materials, which make up, let's say, 3 or 4% of the total weight of the spent fuel. It's a very small fraction, but it's got like 99.999% of the radioactivity. This material is radioactive and gives off a lot of heat over a period of 1,000 or so years. So for every cubic foot of these wastes, at a place like Yucca Mountain, it has to have 2,500 cubic feet of space and ventilation. So you still don't solve your problems of disposal because these wastes are still very hot.
And we're talking about, or at least the Bush administration was talking about, expanding the amount of waste that the United States would be responsible for permanently storing through a program called GNET, which was a proposal for the United States to market nuclear power reactors to developing countries, correct? And for them to then have power, not use it presumably for nuclear weapons, but then the United States would agree to take their waste, their fuel rods, and dispose of them. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of magical thinking. And it's a lot of the thinking that has been going on in our national laboratories, especially those that are very dependent on nuclear energy for decades. I mean, these are concepts that are literally 60 years old. They drag them out whenever they were sort of dormant for a long time. They dragged them out because the Bush administration was really quite regressive in its point of view about what is a good energy mix. So when I was in the Energy Department, we had this idea thrust upon us by the Republican-controlled Congress, and they were breathing down our necks to put a lot of money into this idea of nuclear recycling. And it is intriguing because, at least in principle, the physics seem to indicate that if you could develop the machines to do this, you could convert a lot of these very troublesome isotopes that are nuclear explosives or remain toxic for very long periods of time into less troublesome materials. We asked the National Academy of Sciences to review this, and in 1996, after several years, an exhaustive review, they came back and said this was supremely impractical, that it would cost about $500 billion in 1996 dollars, which is about $700 billion now. And if it worked, it would take 150 years to accomplish the conversion or transmutation of these isotopes. So we sort of looked at this and said, well, that's the end of that. So 10 years later, President Bush shows up and rolls out the same concepts, calls it the GNEP, or Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, and fails to come to terms with how much is this going to cost, how much radioactive waste are you going to be generating, what do you do with all this excess plutonium, how long is it going to take to get rid of this stuff, on and on and on. And of course they basically just stonewalled the Congress, and Congress basically cut the program out. So we don't have a GNEP program anymore. We have a research and development program to look at reprocessing, which I think is an effort to just shore up our aging and antiquated nuclear infrastructure in the United States.
Let me ask you this.
GNEP is effectively over.
In our last minute, I'd like to hear back and forth from you very quickly your respective attitudes about the role of coal versus nuclear power, in which of these potentially hazardous but potentially energy-giving sources we should be either rejecting or going with.
Well, I wouldn't prematurely shut down existing nuclear plants. We, however, do have to go to basically zero electricity generation of greenhouse gases over the next 3 to 4 decades. And in the case of coal, either you solve the carbon capture and storage program or you shut the coal plants down. I mean, you can also substitute out coal for biomass as sort of an interim measure. But fundamentally, coal is in the process of destroying a livable climate. So it is the big, big threat.
Bob?
Well, unless we have some way to finance nuclear power plants through a cap and trade regime or carbon tax or some such mechanism, nuclear power is just not going to go anywhere. And even under the terms of a regime that controls carbon, it's questionable what the role of nuclear would be, because it's so expensive and it has so many unknowns and other big problems associated with it that I've tried to outline. The other issue I think we have not paid attention to in general is that thermoelectric generation in and of itself, that is, if you're producing electricity by burning coal or fossil fuels or fissioning uranium, splitting the atoms of uranium, that this uses more water than any water use in the United States, including agriculture. And that if we start to think about this, there has been no real serious integration of water policy with electrical generation policy. And we're now facing, perhaps because of global warming and climate disruption, we're facing long periods of prolonged droughts in areas where water shortages are occurring, such as the southeastern United States and other locations where we also happen to have a large amount of thermoelectric or nuclear generating capacity here. I've worked on a study which we haven't released yet, but we've been looking at this problem, and basically what we're finding is that in the next 20 years or so, especially if rainfall continues to not fall as it has in the past, and we have these prolonged drought situations and these regional situations, and you look at population growth and energy demand and all these other factors, is that if we continue to go down the path of electrical generation by coal and nuclear in certain regions of the United States, we're going to be precipitating water shortages and rationing.
Well, that's
so
fascinating.
this is sort of a joker in the deck that has really not yet sort of played out on the table.
Well, many thanks to Bob Alvarez and Joe Romm for joining us to discuss energy policy under President Obama. Coming up, a whistleblower story. Welcome back to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen, and we're joined by George Randy Taylor. Think back to 1992 in a primetime live special about junkets for VIPs in the United States to Bermuda. Think about that. Think about George Randy Taylor. Welcome to Whistle Where You Work.
Thank you.
Randy, where'd you grow up?
In Alabama, Gadsden, Alabama.
And then you joined the Navy?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
And in 1992, you were a senior petty officer, and you were also the chief of police at the Bermuda Naval Air Station. What's that?
At the time, was a naval air station that was being used primarily, or the stated purpose was it's used as an anti-submarine warfare base. However, that was not the actual usage of the military installation.
And what was the actual usage?
Actual usage was a resort for members of our government, who's who of our government. That was the place on the long weekends that they would come at taxpayers' expense to working on their suntans, go shopping, that type of stuff.
And who would these people be?
Numerous flag officers, admirals, generals, congressmen, senators. Those were the people that were coming down.
Any senators' names we'd recognize?
Of course, the most prominent, Senator John McCain.
And when he came there, was this before or after he was cited by Congress for ethical lapses related to the Keating 5 case?
This is my recollection. It was within months after he had been sanctioned by Congress concerning the Keating 5 case.
And tell me about the entourage he brought with him.
Senator McCain traveled with his wife, his kids, his nanny, and some members of his staff.
Okay, so it's a junket. We're used to junkets that politicians take. Was there a violation of the law here?
Absolutely.
How so?
Well, taxpayers' money was being redirected to accommodate these visits by these dignitaries coming in. They were unlawfully using government vehicles, chauffeurs, unlawfully using military personnel, pretty much as their personal staff and maids.
And how much money do you think was involved in this?
Once GAO ended up with conducting their investigation, they estimated that it was over $250 million, I believe, that had been wasted, and by closing the installation would save the U.S. taxpayer.
And you were the source for a 1992 primetime live story about this club fed at the Bermuda Station. When you went public with it, how were you treated thereafter by your superiors?
Well, one thing as a whistleblower, and once I did go public with it in the media, I was one of the first people that, particularly in the military, that had ever called their chain of command out in regards to their behavior and conduct and misconduct. I was treated, as you can imagine, as anyone would imagine, very badly. I was referred for psychiatric treatment in an attempt to try discrediting me and my story, as well as...
What was the rationale for referring you for psychiatric examination?
Well, during that period of time and in the military, that was a tactic that was used against anyone that spoke out against the chain of command. Because they would always want to use that excuse and saying, well, the guy's a little crazy, he's not there, and hopefully deflecting any type of criticism, not only from the media, as well as other members of Congress in that time.
Prior to this time, what were your performance reviews like?
Well, I was absolutely exceptional. I was the Navy Sailor of the Year for 1 year, and I promoted up very quickly in the military. I had had an outstanding career.
Mm-hmm. And what did the psychiatrist determine about your fitness for duty?
Found out that I was psychiatrically fit. There was no problem with me, and I was returned to full duty.
And how long did you stay there?
In the psychiatric, I stayed there for approximately a week.
Mm-hmm. And how long did you go back on duty?
I stayed on active duty after that, approximately 2 years. However, after I was transferred, I was granted protection by Congress under the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act. I was transferred to another installation. However, a year to the date of my whistleblowing disclosure, I was hit with a 48-count military indictment for just about any and everything possible.
Before we go there, I want to talk to you about the psychiatrist. Just one more minute. Did the psychiatrist give you any inkling about who referred you for this psychiatric exam?
Absolutely. During this psychiatric evaluation and process, and I took numerous psychological tests, it was disclosed to me by the psychiatrist, Dr. True, during our closing briefing, that, quote, during his time as a psychiatrist, he had never been called by a senator's staff, a secretary of the Navy, nor members of the Secretary of Defense staff to find an individual psychiatrically unfit.
A senator's staff?
Correct.
Any idea who that might be?
It's my opinion, and I've held this opinion and belief wholeheartedly all along that it was Senator McCain's staff.
Were there any other senators who visited the Bermuda Naval Station while you were there?
No.
Okay. Now, you told us about they threw the book at you. Tell me about that.
They did. A year later, my attorneys with the Government Accountability Project had indicated, so they're not done with you. You need to be aware of that. There again, I had a little bit more faith in the system than the average person, having grown up in the military and knowing that the military is filled with great leaders and great people. However, pretty much a year to the day of my initial whistleblowing disclosures, that was when I was hit with a 48-count military indictment.
Wow. And so what became of that?
That was dismissed. I went to a court-martial, and during the phase of the court-martial...
What were they charging you with?
It was related to an incident that involved an individual who had escaped custody, a drug dealer, a known drug dealer, and they had indicated that I had violated various policies, procedures. And once again, however, though, they had stacked the charges against me with 48-count indictment.
Any reason to believe that their doing so was related to your disclosures about Club Fed?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it was later found out during the preliminary hearing that certain admirals had promised each other cases of scotch if they could get me. So there was some scotch riding on it. I just hope it was expensive scotch.
And what's become of Club Fed?
Club Fed was closed. Congress ordered, Congresswoman Schroeder, who was chair of the Armed Services Committee at the time, ordered an immediate investigation. GAO conducted that investigation, found that my disclosures, the merits of my disclosures were accurate and true, and they ordered immediate closure of the installation.
Any idea whether there are similar bases operating today for VIPs?
I'm not so naive now to believe that there's not. However, I would hope, like every other taxpaying citizen, that there's not, particularly in these economic times.
And what are you doing now in these hard economic times?
Believe it or not, I still work for the government. After I retired from the military, went back to work for the government. Okay.
And do you have any regrets about having come forward in this matter?
I think sometimes you do have regrets. However, for me, I've sort of worked through that over the past 12, 13 years. I've worked through that. I'm very proud of what I did. I think that by blowing the whistle was something that the day that I leave, I will be able, for my children today, to say my daddy was an honorable man. And that's, for me, that's the most satisfaction that I could get.
Well, I want to thank you very much for having done it, and we're all better off for it. George Randy Taylor, thank you very much. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Whistle Where You Work.